Good evening. Welcome. Welcome to this special event. I'm Rekha Datta. I'm the interim provost and senior vice president for academic affairs at Monmouth University. This event is part of a Monmouth University Polling Institute initiative to foster thought-provoking conversation on a wide range of topics beyond typical election polling or horse race politics. The Monmouth University Polling Institute was established to be a leading center for the study of public opinion on critical national and state issues. It has earned an A rating, including an A+ from 538.com, one of only 6 polling organizations out of more than 400 nationally to receive this top grade. The Polling Institute provides opportunities for students to enhance their educational experience by working on survey projects as research assistants. The Institute also provides resources and mentorship opportunities for students from various disciplines so they can use their survey research in their own studies and extracurricular activities. The Polling Institute is an integral part of the academic life of Monmouth University. The Institute collaborates with faculty members from different disciplines to study the needs of local, state, and national populations. This is achieved through joint grant proposals and research contracts, developing curricula and courses that include research components, and hosting conferences and public events such as this. George Gallup once said, and I quote, "Polling is merely an instrument for gauging public opinion," end quote. Polling is merely an instrument for gauging public opinion. Why is it important to gauge public opinion? Political scientist V.O. Key, in his 1961 book, Public Opinion in American Democracy, looked into the impact of public opinion on policy. His main argument was that all the talk about democracy is useless unless views of the people are taken into consideration in shaping policy. In general, political scientists try to avoid predicting the future. In my view, polling engages in surveying people's opinion to be able to predict the present or the very near future. The Monmouth University Polling Institute's mission is to foster greater public accountability by ensuring that the public's voice is heard in the policy discourse. And the man behind this magic is none other than our own Patrick Murray. Patrick Murray was named the Monmouth University Polling Institute's founding director in 2005. I like to call him a man with vision and precision. The Asbury Park Press once called his polls freakishly accurate. Patrick frequently appears as a commentator on polling and politics for regional and national outlets. During federal election years, Patrick also serves as an exit poll analyst for the NBC News Decision Desk. I would encourage everyone to visit the Monmouth University Polling Institute webpage, from which I took a lot of the information today, and what I did not get time to include, especially the blog. And our chief guest today, a very, very special person from our own county, our own backyard, as they say, but of national fame. So we are very, very privileged, honored, and delighted to have Olivia Nuzzi, who is New York Magazine's Washington correspondent. Ms. Nuzzi grew up in Monmouth County and attended Middletown South, cutting her journalistic teeth with local outlets while still in high school. She immersed herself into politics and political writing by by working as an intern and gaining knowledge from the field, which is critical training for any political journalist. Olivia is known as a tenacious reporter who pursues unusual angles in today's top political stories, writing with a unique, unfiltered voice. She is currently working on a book about the 2020 elections, which I look forward to reading, perhaps when I retire. So with that, welcome to Monmouth University and to this session, which is going to be invigorating, enlightening, and very informative. I welcome you all, and I turn it over to Patrick.
Thank you very much, Reka. I appreciate that. And we're going into this. The days of being freakishly accurate are behind us right now. But I think if we have some time later, we'll talk about the 2020 election. But the reason why I wanted to bring Olivia in, and it has a lot to do with, I think, what happened in 2020. And the changes that we've seen in political society, political culture in the country right now, and the people who capture that change. And I think Olivia is one of those people who I think represents, a direction that we're taking right now, overall as a country, as well as in terms of politics and in terms of journalism. I first became aware of Olivia, or at least saw her byline, some moons ago. I don't remember exactly how many moons ago it was, in some local outlets here in Monmouth County, right where we're based. And they're fascinating. And because one was a website by, very much a conservative Tea Party type. The other one was an alt weekly newspaper by someone, a former legislator who is clearly on the other side of the political spectrum from the Tea Party. And Olivia was writing for both of them. But one thing that both outlets, I think, had in common is their penchant for basically poking a stick at those in power. And I think that, where Olivia kind of cut her teeth. And I actually wanted to ask you to start off with, Olivia, is you're in high school, and how do you even think, this is what I want to start doing? I'm going to do this for fun, and then it turns into a career. Why did you even come about even thinking that you wanted to do that?
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. And thank you for that introduction. I was really interested in politics, and I thought at the time that I might want to be a speechwriter, actually. And I decided to get involved in local politics in Monmouth County, and I was actually an intern for a District 11 assembly race for Vin Gopal, who was running at the time unsuccessfully in that campaign, but who is now part of the New Jersey legislature. And I had a blog actually about national politics, where I would just kind of riff every day or so, just really to practice writing, frankly, a couple hundred words a day. And Art Gallagher, who runs this website, More Monmouth Musings, that you mentioned, he was sort of a conservative Tea Party type, called me, found my blog, and he asked me to be like a dissenting liberal voice on his conservative blog. And so I wrote a piece about a state level issue about the race that I was interning on, with a disclaimer about the ethical issues about writing about the race I was interning on. And then that was, I think it was Dan Jacobson from the Tri-City News. He saw that and he asked me if I would be a columnist for the Tri-City News. And so I said yes, and no one had ever paid me to write before, because why would they have done so? And I was a columnist for the Tri-City News, I think, for a year or so, and that was my first gig really being paid to write.
So, I mean, you didn't come from a family of writers,
no,
right? So you get very, working class type of family. So, what inspired you to think that I want to write? I want to be a speechwriter. I
was really interested in politics. I remember being home. I guess it was after school. I was watching Oprah with my mom and my friend who lived down the street, and a news conference with Jim McGreevey cut in, where he had an announcement to make, and the first 10 seconds or so, I said, "Oh, he's saying that he's gay." And I remember my mom and my neighbors saying, "That's not what his wife's standing there. He's not saying that." And then at the 1 minute mark or so, Jim McGreevey came out and announced, I think the words were, "I'm a gay American." And I remember thinking, I must have been 11 or so at that time, and I remember thinking that it was very interesting that political language was not really like regular English. It was something a little bit different, and I had an innate understanding of it.
Yeah,
in a way that
his quote there was, my truth is I'm a gay American. That was what he
there you
said.
go.
I remember that clearly.
Yeah, and I just became interested in political language at that time, and I started paying attention to politics. I guess around then, I was also very interested in comedy, and a lot of great comedy is very political. And so I think my interests kind of converged, where I was paying a lot of attention to the news, really just so I could be like in on the joke and keep up with what people were talking about. And the idea, I guess I maybe always wanted to be a writer. I don't really know how that took form, and a speechwriter seemed like kind of an interesting thing to pursue, until I realized that I was not really ideological in the way that I thought that I was once I got involved in politics. And I was not interested in, helping someone lie, which is kind of became clear to me is part of what that job is. And I just, from the first time I interviewed someone, I felt like it was just a lot of fun and like the best possible job you could have, kind of learning about another person's life and beliefs and being able to ask them whatever you want. It seemed kind of amazing to me that that could be a career. And I never really had a conscious like moment where I thought, oh, what do I want to do? I guess I want to do this. I just sort of started committing acts of journalism and never really stopped.
Did you look to folks for, inspiration for what your style was going to be? I note, I'm not the only one who's noted that you have a very unique voice. It's unfiltered in many ways, your voice. As I mentioned, the two of the places that you started with, those two sites, very much were like that. Was that influential in your style, or were you looking at other folks? Did you come to learn about, folks from the past, such as, Hunter Thompson and Tom Wolfe and that style of journalism? What kind of influenced your style?
Probably a little bit of everything. I didn't really go through a phase where I became like obsessed with Hunter Thompson the way that some people do when who are in this business anyway, when they're in high school or college or whatever. But I read a bit of everything, and I think I just really wanted to write things that I would want to read, and I'm definitely a student of new journalism and a student of New York Magazine. And I think my style is very much in line with the history of new journalism of the last half century or so, which is, definitely has a point of view, but is not ideological, and is really just more about a sense of right and wrong. Does that make sense?
Well, your style is, you're kind of like a feature writer style,
Mm-hmm.
but the topics that you write about, or the stories that you write about, aren't technically features. They are news. They're things that are happening, right? I guess what I'm thinking about is that your fit within like New York Magazine. What are they? What's their brief to you of like, go out and do this? What are they trying to get from you?
I mean, I don't really know. I'm the Washington correspondent, whatever that means. I kind of feel like I'm always on safari in Washington or at any political event. My job is just kind of to report back in the most human way possible what this universe is like, what people are like, and what their motives are. It's not really to report the news of the day. The Trump era was kind of a hamster wheel for a lot of journalists, and this daily churn of this fire hose of information. And it was certainly like that for me in a lot of respects, but I kind of have license to observe from 10,000 feet, and to write about the bigger picture and try and write more about kind of what it all means at the end of the day, and what it all means in the broader context of our lives. And not a lot of places are really about that type of slow journalism, if you will. So it's definitely a privileged position at any magazine, I think, in this media environment. But certainly at New York Magazine.
Well, I think one of the pieces that I'm thinking of recently was the Four Seasons landscape press conference by Rudy Giuliani in Philadelphia. And you had said right after it happened that you were going to track down how this came about and how it affected. And then you spent a lot of time, because I noticed you were answering questions that a lot of us were asking, which was that. And I noticed some of the local outlets, some of the national outlets did a quick hit and got whatever information they could get right there, which wasn't a lot at the time, and then forgot about it. And then you decided you were going to keep at it. What, like, take us through that process of what drives you and how you do that, how you go about that.
Well, that was kind of one where, I got a lot of messages from people asking me to look into the Four Seasons Total Landscaping press conference. And I publicly said that I would. And then I was kind of on the hook for actually coming through and doing that and delivering it. I think had I not publicly committed to do it, I might have given up, because I kept running into walls and not getting answers in my reporting. And had I not done that, I might have just thrown up my hands and stopped looking into it. But it was just a process of calling every conceivable person who might know something or who was involved, and trying to put the pieces together that way. And at a place like New York Magazine, I think the question, when it's a profile of someone, it's always like, how do you live with yourself? What motivates you? Why are you doing this? Why are you in politics? It's very strange lifestyle. What draws you to it? With something like a totally weird news event like the Four Seasons Total Landscaping event, it was about putting it in its broader context of that political moment and the Trump campaign and what it said about all the people involved, and also what it said about our reaction to it, that it became this kind of meme that took on a life of its own.
So it certainly did. And speaking of the main character in that, Rudy Giuliani has a reputation for butt dialing many reporters, and you are among them. How do you, using that as one example, and you have many other sources that you've developed, how do you develop that source, which is really integral to your ability to get into these stories?
Well, I wouldn't call Rudy a source so much as a subject. It's not, I would never rely on Rudy for information in a serious way, obviously, given what he's like. But it's just a matter of trying to get to know people and trying to understand them. With Rudy, we've had a lot of ups and downs in our relationship. He has not liked a lot of the things that I've written, and sometimes we've gotten into arguments and it's recovered. Other times, I go a while without talking to him again. It's just a matter of reaching out and doing your best to try and get people to engage with you, and being open about what your motives are as a reporter. I think most people are shockingly they're shockingly optimistic about the press, despite whatever they may say publicly about the fake news media or whatever they call us. And most people really want to be understood. So it's not the gigantic heavy lift that I think it can seem like sometimes from the outside to get people who are confrontational with the media or rude about the media to engage with you, because most people really want an opportunity to explain themselves, or they want publicity, or they want to influence a story or a narrative. And most people, who are in the public eye are like professionals at dealing with the press, and it's just part of what they do. And it doesn't require any special witchcraft to get Rudy Giuliani to pick up the phone.
Okay, I just want to point out to those who are watching that you can use the Q&A icon down at the bottom of this screen to submit questions, and we'll try to get to them as best we can. I'll try to monitor them during the remainder of this conversation, so feel free to jump in and do that as you want. I'd like to kind of switch gears and talk about journalism and politics in general and where we are. There's you talked about being called the fake news. And that has, certainly over the past 4 years, has changed a lot of folks thinking about their approach to journalism. It used to be, you always had to you had to find sources, or at least subjects or quotes from both sides of the story, as it were. And those things have seemed to change. Some are trying to hold on to that. Whereas others saying it's in a different environment. It's in a different environment entirely, and that's not our job. Is not to show both sides, but to show the truth as we see it. Where do you come down on that? What do you think the future holds for journalism?
Well, it's been interesting to watch this debate play out. Again, like at New York Magazine, new journalism is a style it's basically narrative, long form nonfiction writing, right? It reads almost like a novel, or that's the ambition, but it adheres to the facts. And so I've never had a mandate to just be objective and be this news robot like an AP wire, right? My worldview is a really important part of how I approach my work and how I approach a profile or a feature or a news item. But it's been interesting to watch this play out with more conventional mainstream newspapers or networks where these conversations are happening right now. I think objectivity is certainly not something that I aspire to, or that I think is valuable for me and the type of journalism I do, but I understand why it's important if you're at the New York Times or you're at a network to claim to be completely objective. I just don't think, in my experience anyway, when I talk to voters who say are really skeptical of the media, who think the media is fake, it's always been helpful for me to say, like, yeah, I am a part of the liberal mainstream media. New York Magazine definitely skews to the left. And once we get that out of the way, and they realize I'm not trying to fool them or, deny that I have a different worldview than they do, then we can usually have a pretty productive conversation. And that type of honesty is like very important to my conversations with the kind of men on the street type of interviews that you have to do on a campaign trail. And I just never really gotten anything out of trying to pretend that I don't have a worldview, or I don't have beliefs, or I don't have ideas that are not always in agreement with the people that I'm interviewing.
Do you think that the nature of politics has changed, and your ability to talk to people, or the way people talk to you, or has changed? Your political subjects. You mentioned that they still want to talk, that they're still willing to they want to be in the media per se. But has the approach to them changed over the past 5 years in when they're willing to talk to you, or how they're willing to talk to you?
I think social media, and this is true of other types of journalism too, it's clearly true with celebrity journalism. Social media has made it so much easier for politicians to speak directly to their echo chamber and to their voters and people that they care about. And in that sense, I think it can be a bit difficult to not only be speaking to politicians when they're using you for a specific purpose, if that makes sense. If you're Ted Cruz, say, you can get your message out on Twitter or Instagram or on Fox News or Breitbart or on his podcast that he has. And you don't really have to talk to the mainstream media if you don't want to. And so that's sort of strange and sort of new, I think. But it hasn't really, from my perspective, people are always asking me why on earth, if you're a far right politician, why would you talk to me when the result is probably not going to be in your favor? I'm probably not going to be swayed by what you say. You might look like an idiot. And from my perspective, there's no downside for those politicians talking to the mainstream press, because their supporters don't care if I like them or not, or if someone at The Atlantic likes them or not, or any other liberal publication. But it might help them, frankly, if we write a negative article about them, but they're still getting their message out to a wider audience. So from their perspective, it's kind of not that risky, or it's not as risky as it might seem to someone on the outside looking in. And I guess the kind of negative partisanship that's made media so much more divided, that's worsened a lot over the last 5 years and over the time that I've been in journalism. But it hasn't really changed the fact that politicians want attention, and they want to be heard and understood. And people in politics are the same way, even if they're at the operative level. And, I think that kind of outweighs everything else at the end of the day in terms of how accessible people are.
Well, going back to what you were mentioning before about, you had said something about you can understand why a national network or a major mainstream newspaper would want to have an appearance of objectivity. But there's a question on here: does this promote false equivalence, or and I want to put this more directly on you by saying, is this something that you just never would have done? That wouldn't have been your style of journalism to begin with. Or do you think it's even possible to do that style of journalism where you're presenting both sides? Or do you think we're in a situation where it does lead to false equivalence too often when you're trying to, quote unquote, present both sides?
Well, I think you can present both sides, even if one side is like completely deranged and not tethered to reality, without it being a false equivalence, right? I don't think that anything is gained by not explaining what one of the major parties or what a politician from a major party thinks about an issue. I think it's a case-by-case basis about how the outlet in question is handling it. It's hard to kind of talk about here in the abstract. But I think, I understand why in the Trump era, it could seem pretty ridiculous sometimes to say, well, on the one hand, Democrats are arguing this. Meanwhile, the Trump White House is arguing that, Mondays are a false flag operation and they don't really exist. And the conversations that we would have about what the previous president and his supporters believed, or what they were arguing, or what the White House was arguing, were often just completely absurd, whatever your political views were. And I think that made it just emphasized how ridiculous that type of journalism can often be. But generally, I think it's a good principle to include all perspectives that you can include in a story. But I think it's good, like anything else. I think that the Trump era, if it was good for anything, it was useful in that it made us reassess a lot of things that maybe we didn't have to look at too hard before, or it kind of emphasized, certainly in Washington, the grossness of a lot of our standard practices. And I think it's good that it kind of prompted us to take a hard look at some things that maybe we could have just continued to ignore otherwise.
Yeah, there's a question on here about the fairness doctrine, and I think that kind of leads a little bit into, I want to get your thoughts on that, just for folks who don't know. The fairness doctrine was a doctrine back in the pre-cable, basically the pre-cable days, when we had very few national networks, and it was, a responsibility. They had a responsibility, or regulatory responsibility, to present both sides of a story, to be fair whenever they were presenting a story. But it didn't apply to cable, and then it disappeared in the Reagan administration. So over 30 years ago, it disappeared, and allowed even more so for outlets to decide, I'm going to pick this point of view, and that's all I'm going to talk about. What's your point of view on the talk right now that is happening? There is real talk that's happening, of bringing it back some form of that fairness doctrine, that requirement?
Well, I think the Trump era, one small example of this issue is the Trump era. At the very beginning, they were talking about limiting access to the White House briefing room and limiting outlets that they thought were fake news or whatever. And you could see why that's seems like a terrible idea when Donald Trump and his minions are in charge, right? Like their idea of a fake news outlet or something that's illegitimate is probably very different than what my view or your view of a fake news or an illegitimate outlet is. So my view on that has always been that we don't want politicians or any ideological actors deciding what's a legitimate viewpoint or what's a legitimate outlet and what isn't. And similarly, with the fairness doctrine, I guess it's all a matter of who gets to decide what is a fair representation of a viewpoint, or what's a fair representation of both sides. And it all comes down to how it would be applied. And if it doesn't apply to, this conversation always comes up in the context of Fox News, but if it doesn't apply to cable news, and you're just going to be affecting network news, if you watch a network news broadcast, it's not, them being polarized one side or the other is not really a problem. It's more, I think, a false equivalency issue with most network news or most super mainstream television coverage. So I think the conversation is interesting, and I think it's good that we're having it, but I don't think that it's the solution to the problem of Fox News or hyper-partisan right-wing media that some people seem to think that it is.
Yeah. Well, with all the criticism that journalism is getting, political journalism is getting right now because of this, this issue of the hyperpartisanship. What do you think? Are there bright spots there? Are there things that you see where journalism is doing really well in handling the challenges of today? Anything that you think of when you say, these folks are doing it right, or this is the right approach, and we need to be doing more of that?
Talking about the media is like talking about the universe, right? It's so big. It's almost silly to talk about it as if it's a monolith. I think some of the best reporting, certainly of my lifetime, occurred during the Trump era. And when people talk about the media's missteps during that era, oftentimes they're really talking about commentators and opinion writers and the op-ed section, and not about reporters and reporting. So I think there's a lot of, like, this is a non-answer, I'm sorry, but like there are a lot of great things happening in the media right now, and a lot of great reporting, and a lot of people who are using these new platforms in a really productive, interesting, useful way. And then there's a lot of bullshit and a lot of bad stuff happening, and a lot of hyper-partisan, polarizing, generally unproductive or destructive media that's also proliferating. And I don't think that you could say it's all good or it's all bad. I think the democratization of media, it's like anything else. It's great on the one hand that things are so open and that there's so many different platforms and media is so big. On the other hand, it is pretty unwieldy, and we see a lot of the pitfalls pretty plainly.
What about the role of social media and journalists creating their own brand image using social media? And I'm thinking in particular, since you kind of just mentioned, there's somewhere the brand makes sense. Like for you, what I read of you on social media is an extension of what I read in you in print, because that's your approach. Whereas there are others who are, well-known investigative journalists per se, who are on social media, who are mixing, their own views or some commentary with their investigations, which to me, in some cases, seems to undermine their credibility, but not always. And I don't know what the balance is of that, but what's your opinion of that?
My opinion is I'm glad that I'm not at a news outlet where being a human being is in any way undermining my work or anyone's opinion of me. It seems very difficult to be one of these reporters who is not allowed to have a worldview or an ideology. It's strange. It's like this double-edged sword where you really need social media. You need to be present on social media in order to be a part of the political media today and the conversation and the discourse. And I certainly wouldn't have a career probably the way that I do if it were not for social media. And on the other hand, you could completely ruin your life and your career with like a single tweet. So it's kind of it's a perilous position to be in. I don't know what the answer is. I think some reporters do it very well, and it seems like it's a useful extension of their work, and other reporters, it seems to undermine their credibility, as you said, or to otherwise make them suspect. I don't, sometimes I love Twitter, sometimes I hate it personally. It just depends on what the news cycle is like.
Well, Twitter raises actually a good question for just our understanding like that inside the Beltway mentality, because it's, you have inside the Twitter mentality. And we have this, and this is something that I think about a lot as a public opinion pollster, where my job is, if I need to talk to people out on the street. And in fact, in some occasions, I've actually run into you out in the middle of nowhere in Iowa, right? And we've run across each other doing somewhat of the same thing. We're out there just trying to talk to people to figure out, what they're really thinking. And Twitter has the what I believe is a well-deserved reputation of amplifying that inside the Beltway discussion, in the sense of, this is what people think are important. These are the things that people really care about, because you keep seeing it repeated over and over and over again on social media. So do you see that as a danger for journalists about getting too caught up in that?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, I think generally it's good to not be behind your desk, behind a computer screen, and generally it's better to be out in the world talking to human beings. But you mentioned you and I running into each other in Iowa, or I don't know where we were, but at most political events, you kind of run into the same exact issue that you run into on Twitter, which is that the people who show up to, let's say, a Pete Buttigieg speech in the middle of a workday in Iowa are not, normal people, right? You have to be a certain type of person to take time out of your life to go see a politician who is not going to be president yet speak in a gymnasium, right, on a Wednesday. The people that you run into there are hyper interested in politics, hyper aware of politics and political debates, right, and follow the discourse. And so I never feel like I'm getting a real sense of what real America thinks when I'm at an event in an early primary or caucus state. It always feels kind of like an extension, frankly, of the Twitter discourse. Maybe it's not the same thing as the elite media discourse that maybe you or I are plugged into a lot of the time, but it's certainly not a representative of I think what voters in general think to talk to people at political events. But it's probably an improvement to following whatever the trending topics in Washington are.
What I find is useful for me when I'm out there doing that kind of thing is that when you go to one of these early events where there's 50 people show up at a pizza ranch in Iowa for this event, is to wait.
Wait, I've never been to a pizza ranch. I've been through 2 caucuses in Iowa, and I've still
never a pizza ranch event.
I've never set foot in a pizza ranch.
Oh, you don't know what you're missing. Anyway, yeah, and being from Jersey, you don't actually eat the pizza.
It looks disgusting.
Yeah. But what I found was useful is you wait for it to clear out. And right, you talk to the people who were sitting there already before everybody showed up, who right, weren't there and then are still there because they came there to eat, not for this event. And I find those are the ones that you get the the most out of when talking to. Those kinds of things, and it does keep you grounded. And in fact, if I could have bottled a lot of those discussions that I had and then turned them into actual polling, I think overall over the last few years, I probably would have been more accurate as a pollster, just being able to get that. But there's a question here that, and I'm not sure how to ask this or if you can answer it, but somebody says that you mentioned your quote unquote worldview several times, and how would you describe your own worldview?
I don't mean in terms of ideology. I don't mean left or right or, explicitly political. I just mean in terms of my sense of right and wrong, where I'm from. You mentioned my background. We all have a specific way that we look at the world based on a variety of different factors. And so even if we're being objective, right? If I woke up tomorrow and I worked for the AP, let's say, and I was just sticking to the who, what, where, when, why of it all, what I would decide to report would still be informed by my worldview, right? Would I decide to, if you or I were writing up our conversation here, what we both decided to include or omit would be a result of our specific worldview. So I just mean literally the way that I look at the world in general, broadly, not, as a liberal or as a conservative or anything like that.
I want to go back now to, let's go back to the very beginnings now that the question has come up, because I think when you said you and I would have different views or recollect things differently, or what we choose to emphasize in our memory of this would be different because of our worldview. And I think a lot, people ask me about, polling, where do you come from? And for me, a sense of place is really important, geographic place and where you come from, and that identity really plays a role in a lot. And it has, as you said, it has nothing to do with liberal, conservative, or anywhere in between. And it just is, it's a part of my worldview from where I grew up, has a lot to do with the importance of where you fit in geographically as being an important part of your identity. What are things that you talk about your parents a lot, and your father in particular being influential? Are there things in that you can point to and say that really that's really affected my worldview? This is kind of the things that I think are important that I need to do, or that I emphasize because of these formative experiences.
I'm trying to think. I mean, it's hard to speak about generally, I guess. What I'm talking about here, I guess, is almost maybe you would call it a subconscious bias that we all bring to any event as reporters, or anything that we're observing. I'm sure that I grew up in a union household. My dad worked for the sanitation department in New York, though I was raised in Red Bank, New Jersey. And I'm sure that plays a lot into the way that I think about how politicians appeal to the working class or to blue collar voters, because that's not some theoretical thing to me. But I don't, it's not as though I strongly identify as like someone who was raised in a working class kind of lapsed Catholic household, and as though like that is how I consciously identify on a daily basis when I approach my work as a reporter. I think all of that stuff is mostly probably just comes through in terms of subconscious bias, like I said, and it's not stuff that I am actively meditating on when I'm interviewing someone, or when I'm deciding what I think is important or unimportant with any particular story.
So let's turn to 2020, and mentioned in the beginning of it, in the intro, you're working on a book with Ryan Lizza on the election. What can you reveal about the book so far? And specifically, I mean, just like, is there a particular angle or something else that others have missed in the story that you're hoping that you can shed some light on in this book?
Yeah, it's called How the Pollsters Found. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Not really. I can't really talk about it that much. We've been working on it for a while, certainly since before the primary started, and we're really just trying to focus on when you have something that long of a period of time when so much has happened. If you think about everything that's happened in politics and in American life and culture in the last 2 years, really 2.5 years, it's a lot. And so it's really been a process of trying to kind of curate the most important moments over the last 2 or 2.5 years since the primary started. And I mean, mostly when we're working on it, it's just shocking to consider how much occurred in that time. You know, you have the pandemic and all the economic implications of the pandemic, and impeachment and another impeachment and a deadly insurrection, and 500,000 Americans dead by January. It's a lot to kind of go through, and most campaign books over the last couple cycles anyway have been kind of inside baseball TikToks of pretty incremental developments in a primary and in a general, and that's decidedly not the approach that we're taking with our book. But it's a hard story to tell in some ways, even though it's kind of a simple story too, if you look at things from 10,000 feet.
Well, you think about all that's changed, and I know one thing that as a pollster, and I think journalists in your position is that now we get true breathers from day to day, like that you can think about that. Hey, I think I might have this weekend off and nothing will happen. Or for me as a pollster, it was we'd start we think news would be breaking, we'd create a questionnaire about the news and questions to ask about the news, and it's possible that some of those things would be irrelevant by the time we finished interviewing 4 or 5 days later. What do you think is the lasting impact of the Donald Trump era, as it were? And I don't mean in political terms. I don't mean in the policies or that kind of thing. I mean in terms of journalism and the way we approach politics and we approach political journalism. What's the lasting effect, and what things do you think might wear off over the next few years?
It's hard for me to say because that was 2016 was the first campaign I ever covered, and Donald Trump's administration was the first administration I ever covered. And so I don't have anything where I didn't prior to the new administration coming in. I don't have much to compare it to. Everyone was talking about the return to normal. I had never experienced normal before. So it's hard for me. In some ways, I think that was great to be coming at the Trump era without any preconceived ideas about what Washington was ordinarily supposed to be, or any sense of what the conventional wisdom ought to be. And in some ways it was a hindrance, because institutional knowledge, it was really important to understanding what was really strange that he was doing, what was not that strange. So I relied a lot on more old-timer reporters around the White House and in Washington to help me through that. But going into this new era, it's sort of been, I feel like I've been sitting back and observing a lot more than I was at the beginning of the Trump era, because this is all new to me. I never covered the left or Democrats as much as I covered what became the primary field in 2016 and the right and the trends on the far right. And so it's as much a mystery to me as it is to anybody else about, what we hold on to from the Trump era, or what goes away.
In some ways, do you think that might give you a kind of a leg up on perspective, in the sense that you don't have preconceived notions about what ought to be? Because I think that was some of the criticism of reporting early on in the Trump administration from folks like me and others, whereas that journalists who have been around a long time, observers who had been around a long time, where this is the way you're supposed to behave. And once Trump gets into office, he'll understand that this is different, or whatever. And it took them some of them, it took a long time to come around to, oh no, he's going to be different. This is going to be different. None of the norms of behavior that we would expect would constrain somebody in his position or those around him apply. And you almost didn't come into, you came into it without kind of those preconceived notions of that.
Well, I think it was helpful for me to be an outsider while trying to understand people who were outsiders in a different way, who were new to Washington in a different way. I think it was useful trying to get into the people whose heads I was trying to get into, to have kind of a shared lack of clubbiness in DC and with the kind of elite in crowd here. That was helpful. But like I said, I think it was also, it also had me, it was also a hindrance in some ways, because it was important to know, okay, Trump's really late all the time. How normal is that for a president to be really late? And, maybe a photographer at the White House would say, oh, Clinton was really late too. This isn't that strange. It's not that weird for a president to be so late. Or he would do something else that day and it would be, oh no, we've never seen this before. We've been here since Carter, and this is the first time we've seen this. So it was definitely, it was useful, I think, to have both. It was good to have kind of a fresh perspective in some ways, and certainly in trying to understand people psychologically in the Trump administration, or in Trump's orbit. That was useful. But I also think, there's a lot to be said for experience and for having a lot of institutional knowledge, and that was also something that I certainly valued in other people's coverage.
And on another topic entirely, and a question that's come up here from someone who's watching, is about diversity and representation in journalism, racial, ethnic, issues. They're specifically asking about African Americans and the Latino community. As a woman, you probably face some different issues as well. Is journalism doing what it needs to do to get those voices out there? Is it reflecting those voices? Are we seeing that in the journalists themselves? Is this journalism as a whole? I guess the question is, just from your perspective, do you think journalism is on the right path and dealing with this issue?
I think, in the last year, since George Floyd was murdered, certainly newsrooms around the country, and my own newsroom is no exception, have been reassessing diversity on our staffs and in our newsrooms, as well as how we are covering these issues. And I think that's great. I think that the more conversations about that and the more that we take a hard look at how we're conducting ourselves and who we're promoting and who we're hiring, the better. From my perspective, there's no downside to doing that. And I think the media is certain. You asked if we were on the right path. I think so. It seems like everyone's sort of having these conversations and assessing what's happening in their own organizations right now at the same time. And I also hope that while we're addressing racial diversity on our staffs and in our newsrooms, that we're also addressing socioeconomic diversity, and that we're addressing the fact that certainly mainstream news or mainstream media organizations tend to represent on our staffs. It's a particular worldview where most people are from elite organizations, they're from elite colleges, they're of the same mind. And I think that is really disastrous for coverage in general, whether it's a mainstream, objective news outlet, or it's a magazine, or it's a radio station, or it's a TV network. I think that we should be paying attention to, where people are coming from in general, just as we're paying attention to race and gender and sexual orientation and all of those other things.
What else do you think sure I want to put this. You know, what stories, political stories, do you think journalism? And again, I'm using the term the media journalism, whatever, and I know it's overly broad. But if you had to say, you know, you have your own area that you cover and the things that you follow, but what do you think? What would you say that you wished somebody else out there was covering a little better, was doing more of, or was getting deeper into? Something that you couldn't do yourself, but you would love to see somebody else doing it.
I don't know. I don't know if I'm not sure. I'd have to think about that. Yeah, I'd have to think about that. I don't know. Most of the time I feel like there's so much that I want to read and so much media that I want to consume that I don't have time to consume it all. And I constantly have, you know, dozens of tabs open everywhere that I'm meaning to get to. Most of the time I feel overwhelmed by how much I have to read, and I'm not really asking for more things on those subjects to read. But I have to think about that and get back to you.
Well, it's like the same thing when you promise to follow up on total landscaping, Four Seasons Total Landscaping. You got to do that next, because we're all interested in seeing the story unfold there. Do you think of you mentioned about talking to having to learn some of the ropes about how Washington worked from your older journalistic colleagues who have been around for a while. Thinking about, different generations and what informed them. And it's a question that I was thinking of, and I was kind of dancing around it with you earlier on. But, when you growing up in a definitely the post-Watergate era, but more so when things like 9/11 are kind of like a part of your formative years, that kind of things where that's where you start hearing about what the world is like. Mm-hmm. And I grew up in I'm just a tad older than you, so I grew up in an era where we're still Watergate, and we're learning about Watergate and the problems with government, but there's still our parents and so forth. There's still this sense of the greatest generation is still around in huge numbers, and this sense that the American system is still a great system. And then you get to millennials and you're talking about all they're hearing is that government is horrible and everything about it is horrible and it changes your worldview. Now, somebody asked this question, and my question to you is, do you think that is a fair assessment of a younger generation, of their view of government being that they lack that older sense, from the bygone era of government as something that would just work, and you just say, okay, great, let it go. We might have some problems with it, and we have some questions. Whereas the younger generation has just always seen government as being dysfunctional. Do you think that's fair or not?
Well, I'm certainly not like a representative of everyone in their 20s. I can't speak for how other people in my peer group think about this. But I don't think, if this is maybe more of a question for you, if you think that younger voters tend to be more aligned with Democrats, then that doesn't really make sense to me. Right. If most younger voters support Democrats, then that would seem to disprove that very notion. I don't have.
Well, I'm even thinking, not necessarily like being Democrat or Republican. I'm just thinking if it's fair, and maybe it's a question for younger people who get into journalism might be different than younger people who don't get into journalism. Maybe younger people who get into journalism are more likely to think government has something to offer than their peers. And maybe the criticism maybe the observation about millennials is correct, that they just have a different view of government because they've seen government behave differently than older generations has. But maybe journalism appeals more to folks who still feel government has something to offer. I guess maybe that's the the observation being offered?
I don't know. I mean, I don't. I mean, speaking strictly for myself, I have no idea why other people get into journalism, or if it has anything to do with their view of government and its ability to function or not. I just think that politicians are fascinating. It is a completely unnatural way to live and exist and relate to other people, constantly seeking their approval and seeking to be reelected. I think it's extremely strange, and as a subject matter to write about, that's great from my perspective. It's endlessly fascinating to me. So that motivates me, trying to understand that, and understand why people seek power, or why they want to hold on to it, or what motivates them, and what people in power think and believe and feel, and why what becomes history, why those decisions are made on a human level. That's really interesting to me. That's what motivates me to want to do this, much more than any general idea about government being dysfunctional, which it obviously is, or government being a problem. I don't really think in that way as much as I think on a human level about the people that I'm interested in and covering.
Great. We're coming up on our time. So I just want to squeeze in a couple more questions from some of my colleagues here at Monmouth, who teach in the communications department. One of the questions is what's your perspective on the disappearance of local news media outlets? Art Gallagher and More Monmouth Musings is still going strong there, but the local newspapers like the Asbury Park Press are not as strong. What do you think is what do you think that means, and what's the landscape, particularly as it affects, I think what we were just talking about, our belief in civic, in the good of a civic society and government working and all those kinds of things?
Oh, I mean, I think it's completely terrible for all of us. I think it's terrible for us in our neighborhoods and where we live and understanding our communities. And I think it's terrible for the news media in general. It's terrible for our basic understanding of how things function around us. And I really don't know what the answer is. I think everything is increasingly nationalized, and everything's increasingly about national politics and national issues. And in one sense, that's really interesting, and I completely understand that impulse. But on the other hand, it's extremely important to care about and understand what's happening at a granular level around you and in your community. And I think it's a tragedy that's just disappearing all around us, and these publications are being just filleted and eaten up by these hedge funds, and nothing seems to be stopping it.
Yeah, I mean, this is a larger conversation.
It's a much larger conversation.
It's beyond both of us to actually know what the solution is to that. I think we both agree that it's bad, but what's the solution?
And it's terrifying. But I don't know I certainly don't know what the solution is.
Well, it used to be you got your start writing again for these blogs and kind of these columns. But it used to be you would cut your teeth on covering the Board of Education in your local town, and that for the local newspaper. And those things are gone, and it's not only gone the training ground for if you screw up, it's only the local Board of Education who, and you start learning things, but also people get news about their local Board of Education that way.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that's certainly true. Like it's important to be able to screw up on a smaller scale than like a national election or something like that. But it's also just I'm one of them, but these reporters are just kind of thrown into the deep end, covering politics and covering the most important issues at the highest, most visible level, without any training, as you said, right? Covering organizations on a smaller scale, or so it's a very strange, just speaking from my own experience, very strange to learn on the job when the stakes are that high. And I certainly had that experience the first couple of years of my career, where it felt completely insane sometimes to be covering these things for the first time, with the kind of platform that I had early on. So I don't know what the solution is, but I think we're all, certainly worse off for it.
Okay, one more question before we kind of just end on anything note that you want to end in. So I know a speechwriter for a high-level politician who, talks about being inspired by the Sam Seaborn character in West Wing, and that kind of got him into thinking about speechwriting. You had mentioned speechwriting before, but the question is actually just about political fiction, movies, TV, novels. Is there something out there, not that necessarily inspired you, but that you really like, that we might not know about, so that this professor can use it and assign it to a student in his classroom?
Oh my goodness, can I email this professor after I think on that?
Absolutely.
I love that question. It's not very original or obscure to say that I've watched Veep like 6 times all the way through. But I have to think about that, because I love consuming political shows and political novels, and I'd have to think about that in order to give him or her a proper answer.
All right, I'll connect you.
Okay, thank you.
I will do that. All right, as we end, you can add anything you want at the end, anything that you want to leave us with, but I would also like it if you can address a young person who's thinking about getting into political journalism today. What kind of advice would you give them?
I guess my main piece of advice would just be to try really hard to understand people that you're writing about, and to be empathetic, and to try to think about the cost and the human beings that you're covering, and what the human effect is of whatever issue you're covering is. Because I think it's very easy to forget that we're writing about other human beings, and we're covering other human beings, and that should be the main consideration, is like what effect the policy or the politician or the election is having on human beings. I think it's very easy to kind of get into these philosophical political debates, or to jump on these bandwagons attacking people, or being overly simplistic about complicated ideas. And I think the most important thing is to kind of slow down and think about the human effect of the things that we're writing about. And in terms of the industry, it really is a case-by-case basis. Some people can afford to do an unpaid internship, and that's their way in. A lot of people cannot do that, and they have to find other ways to be able to freelance, or to get their foot in the door. And it's really just about figuring out what's realistic for you in terms of opportunity, and finding connections and networking with people. But anyone who is watching this and thinking about this is welcome to email you and get my email address and contact me directly, because it's hard to answer in an abstract way.
Thanks. Appreciate
Not that I know anything, not that I know what I'm doing at all, but I'd be happy to try and help someone figure it out.
That's great. All right, Olivia, I appreciated following your career from the very beginning. I always
Thanks for all the quotes. I appreciate it.
Oh yeah, anytime. I enjoy when we run into each other in the boondocks of wherever it is in the world, and keeping up with what's going on, and just keep up the good work. I just
thank you very much.
You got a great voice in this field that really adds something to our understanding of what's going on. And so I do appreciate that as well. And thanks for taking the time tonight to talk to us. All right, thanks. And this will be on our YouTube channel at the Monmouth Poll's YouTube channel sometime in the near future. So if anybody missed it or had a friend who missed it, you can put them onto it, and we'll send out a notice when that goes up. Thanks again, and I wish everyone a good and healthy and safe night.
Thank you.